Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about heroism and the American dream. And no, I'm not talking about the American dream of a chicken in every pot. I'm talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and how the principles of heroism play into that. Because we've already started to get to the point within the cultural reversal that we're going through wherein the wheat needs to be separated from the chaff. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean the fact that if you look at the original concept of what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is, if you look at that basis for what the great American experiment is, it's not liberalism. You might think it would be, but it isn't. It's actually natural law, which is a very, very conservative concept. And the reason why I started thinking about this was because I was on Twitter, and I'm trying to interact a little more with Twitter these days, just because people have been rightfully roasting me in my comments saying, you need to get some more new material. Stop going back to the old wells. So I'm looking for new sources of information to confirm the same things that I have confirmed in the past, although I will utilize both. But my Twitter is actually expanding fairly well, even though I'm being blocked from posting most of the time. Which means, of course, I come in contact with people who want to do nothing but tear down what I have built. And oh, by the way, if you want to know what I built, there are 2 links in the description in the pinned comment for my graphic novels. And you're looking at some of the beautiful art for those in the background. But anyway, this attempt by the, I take it, quote-unquote progressive people on Twitter is to tear down what I have built by doing things like trolling me, trying to anyways, I don't really respond, and when that didn't work, trying to set up controversy between myself and other YouTubers. Now, I got no problem with having controversy with other YouTubers, but at the very least, get my message right. At the very least, don't make up things that I say. Quote me. And this is what someone tried to do. They tried to stir up trouble between myself and I think Melanie Mack, who I don't even know if I've actually even spoken to her. I think I follow her on Twitter. I don't really watch her content at all, for no real particular reason, except for the fact that I like my content to be more information focused, I guess. But I really haven't even sampled her content. And it seems like the reason why they're trying to stir up controversy between me and Melanie Mack, again, I think that's her name, is because she and Razorfist are being called out as moral nags. Basically, the conservative equivalent of quote-unquote progressive people. And again, the same with Razorfist. I do watch some of his content, but I don't think I've ever really interacted with him. I think we had one brief exchange, which probably consisted of about a dozen words. So I'm not talking specifically about these 2 individuals, about Razorfist and Melanie Mack. I'm talking about what they're being accused of, which is being moral nags, and how that is being painted as, well, you're just the same as the quote-unquote progressives on the left, except you're on the right. There's no difference. You're trying to do the exact same thing, just with a different political ideology. But here's the thing. I talk about American entertainment, mostly. I focus a lot on American comic books and the American comic book system, so it's American entertainment. And I focus on the American ideal of things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the American pursuit of merit above all else. And the thing is that the American experiment is built upon morality. Because I fully realize that in this day and age anyways, in order to win an election, in order to get control of the country, you need the people in the middle. You need the independents, the libertarians, those people especially, and this is the way it is, there have been study after study to show this, of European descent, because they're the only ones who will flip back and forth from one party to another. But at the same time, you have to realize that if you want the country to work in the way that it's supposed to, if you want it to be the beacon on the hill for liberty, you can't have the liberalism of most of the people in the center right now. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean the liberalism that says the only things that should be illegal are things that cause someone else harm. That is the basis for that kind of morality. But no, I'm sorry. Politics, which is an extension of moral philosophy, makes and breaks laws, and laws are moral standards that the country lives by and sometimes dies by. And that moral standard for the American experiment is not whether or not you're going to hurt a third party or a secondary party. It's whether or not your law is based upon what is right and what is wrong. Now let me bring this back down to earth for a minute, going back to Twitter. One of the other things that I saw on Twitter this week was a video from Clownfish TV, which again, I don't watch a whole lot of their content because they're spectacularly good at extending the video to the exact point where they get the maximization of profit from their videos, which I can't fault them for doing that. This is their source of income, but it doesn't make for the best information processing machine. But anyway, Apparently, Jeff Bezos and the New York Times are being pressured to reverse the way that they operate in order to entice back middle America. And when I saw that tweet from Clownfish, I made a sarcastic post of my own about it. But really what I wanted to say, and what automatically I was thinking about when I saw that, was the story that I go over every once in a while about Bobby Chase. Bobby Chase was, if you don't know, one of the editors-in-chief for Marvel Comics. This was back in the 90s when they had 3, 4, maybe 5 editors-in-chiefs at the same time, because Marvel was divided up into fiefdoms, and each one had its own editor-in-chief, depending on the content that they were producing. Anyway, she is credited with being the first person to really enter the progressive, quote-unquote progressive, conversation into Marvel Comics. And so they are interviewing her on, I think it was the Women of Marvel podcast in 2019, if I remember correctly, talking to her about this and talking to her about how she got into Marvel Comics. And she relates, again, not secondary information, but from the horse's mouth, how she says she got into Marvel Comics. She was looking for a job. She applied for a job. She didn't know it was at Marvel Comics. She didn't really care about Marvel Comics at the time. This was in the 80s. It was a job. She didn't care. They interviewed her and said, sure, you seem like you can do this job. However, again, as she relates, she was told, you're going to have to check your Northeastern politics at the door because the majority of our readers are Middle America, and they don't take too kindly to the Northeastern liberal politics that you and the other people around us here in New York actually ascribe to. And she relates again that she nodded her head yes, with the full intent not only of ignoring that particular thing, but in destroying that particular way of thinking. Again, she relates how her parents taught her to do this by infiltrating and gumming up the works of Republican Party this and that. But again, the point being that at that point in time, as she relates anyways, she says that where the majority of Marvel Comics got sold was in Middle America. Now, I would say it's not just Middle America. It's really non-city America. Because again, you look at PA, you look at California, if you take out the cities, they would probably go Republican all the time. Whether or not that would be the same for New York, I'm not entirely sure. New England, probably not. But anyway, it's very much city versus country, although I'll just refer to it as Middle America. And she was very much of the opinion that, well, those country rubes, they have to be taught a lesson or two, whether they like it or not, because we are sophisticated New Yorkers and we know better. And that's what I was thinking about when I read that headline about the New York Times trying to get back readership in Middle America. If they want to get back readership in Middle America, they need to play to Middle America. And the whole point of what I was just saying, of why there is a difference between Middle America and the coastal cities, is something very basic. It's common sense. And common sense plays directly into ideas like the American dream, directly into ideas like heroism, which again would be one of the reasons why Marvel Comics probably sold so well in Middle America. And why is this the case? Well, it's the case because people who live in the country, or at the very least not in big cities, have to be much more in tune with things like how nature works, or at the very least the wrath of nature, because you don't have all of those mechanisms to protect you from these things. And therefore you have to engage personal mechanisms in order to make up for this, in order to make sure that, well, sometimes basically you stay alive. And sometimes that looks like I need to understand how things work in order to prepare for what might happen. But it also might look like I need to have a closer connection with my family because if things go wrong, they're the ones that are going to help me. Or I need to have a closer connection with my religious affiliation because if things really go south, they're going to help me. I need to have a closer connection with the people around me and my community, etc., etc. Because you need to be much more responsible for yourself when you live in a more rural area. And this became readily apparent over the last, 5 years, especially 2020, 2021, 2022, where you had these people living in cities who quite honestly did not understand that food doesn't just magically appear on the shelves of your grocery store. It actually has to come from a farm. Or things like meat actually comes from an animal. One of the most ridiculous ones was when things were all shut down and people couldn't get butter in New York City, and one small convenience store was making its own butter and saying to people, come and buy it here. And people were buying it and saying, only in New York City could you get this. And I'm just slapping myself on the head going, my sweet merciful heavens, you're stupid. Because I have people, even today that I know, that make their own butter. I live in the country, by the way. Never do they buy butter from the grocery store. It ain't that hard. And I also have some other personal experience with this because although I do live in the woods, I live in a cabin in the woods, cottage in the woods. At the same time, I also live about 300 yards away from the shore of the ocean. And the summers here aren't that bad. They're actually pretty nice. So you get people coming here for vacation, usually from city-like areas, saying, wow, we should retire here. And they look at the price of land or the price of houses or the price of building materials and go, wow, we could make out like bandits here. All we got to do is sell our home in whatever city it is, take that money, and we could buy a McMansion here or build one. And they go ahead and do that. And they usually last about 2 years here, and then they leave. Why? Because they can't take the responsibility of living in the country. They just can't. The more fortunate ones actually do get to leave. There is a house not too far from me, probably about 10 miles, which is basically a small McMansion. It was built by someone from a city. They moved here. They lasted about 2 years. Then they put it up for sale because they just couldn't hack it. They sold it to a family. Again, from the city. This guy had big plans of doing all of these things in the country. Moved his family out here, started to homeschool his kids, never interacted with anyone in the community at all. Decided to do all of this work on his property himself, even the dangerous stuff. And one day, he just didn't come home. And his wife had to pack up the kids and move back to wherever they came from. And that McMansion has spent the last, 5, 8 years just rotting in the woods. So my point is that in big ways and small, if you want to survive the country, you need to have common sense. And common sense is the basis for heroism, for reason, for logic, for natural law, and thus for the American dream. And what does common sense mean? Because people tend to get this wrong. Common sense, in its rational and logical form, is to say that, yes, I understand that my senses can cheat. That's why I use all of my senses in common in order to determine what this thing is and how it works. And by the way, the older form of senses is more than just your bodily senses. That's why in English we have phrases like a sense of humor, a sense of direction, a sense of justice, a sense of disgust, which would really just be a gag reflex, things like that. So you use your common sense to say, hey, look, the world exists around me. That's a given. Now, let me use my senses to determine what things are and how they work within reality. Use my senses in common to determine whether or not there's any fault in any of those senses. Then we take all of that sensory information, we apply more strict standards to it, like reason, follow that upward into principles of how reality works, which is logic, and then take those principles and impose them back downward onto the things which we do in normal everyday life, all the while ensuring and double checking that if there are mistakes, we go back and fix them, we alter what we know according to what is real, and this is the basis of how we understand human existence. And yes, while many people in the country will never get to that level of understanding, at the very least they have the basic form of that understanding, which is common sense, because they need to. And again, I would argue this is why Marvel Comics sold so well back in the 80s in Middle America, why it was their breadbasket, so to speak, of profit for their comics, because people in the country have a sense of justice. And that's what superheroes are. They are people who have such a strict and hearty sense of justice, usually because of the pathos, the suffering in their life that they had to go through concerning something just and unjust. They have such a strict sense of that justice that they then can go out and do things which are supplementary to the pursuit of justice. Middle Americans understood this. Why? Because that form of understanding what justice is, according to common sense, then reason, then logic, that form of understanding justice which feeds into natural law is an understanding of justice, is an understanding of morality that comes from there is a right and there is a wrong, and you can either be on one side of the line or the other. The basis for morality and justice is not, did you hurt someone? And sure, did you hurt someone may be a part of the equation, but it's not the basis of the equation. And if you try to use it as the basis of your equation, that's just relativity. In moral circles, it's called situational ethics, which again is just a form of relativity. And America and the American dream was not built on relativity. Because most people look at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and say, liberty is there, and liberty is the number one thing, and it outshines all the rest. Because sure, first you have to have life in order to have liberty, but then they stop there. They don't realize that the next part is the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness comes from the idea that you have a fixed human nature, and that human nature, if you wish to fulfill it, is the path of happiness. Fulfilling the path of happiness, which is prescribed by your human nature, is done solely through working with reality. And thus, from that, we understand that there are some forms of reality that do nothing but destroy, and destroy sometimes just the ability to be happy, and therefore, doesn't matter whether they hurt a secondary party or not. They're outlawed. They're morally unacceptable. Because again, liberty is shaped by life, but it's also shaped by the pursuit of happiness. That's why, at the very least, up until, the 90s, if you wanted to end yourself, that was against the law. And things like drug use, it's against the law. Why? I'm not hurting anybody. Why? Because it's a moral evil. Why? Because it is a use of your liberty in a way that actually destroys the pursuit of happiness. So again, to bring it back down to the street level, as it were, I'm looking at videos from people like, I think his name is Archcast, and I know he's not American. I think he's Scandinavian, something like that, talking about how we have to defend against the moral nags by ensuring that pornography is always available to everyone. And I'm going, huh? How does that follow? Please tell me the rational and logical way that your argumentation is supposed to support what you're saying. You want to make that argument? Go right ahead. You might be able to even make a good argument for that. Because honestly, I'm looking at some heavy theological and philosophical giants in the field. And yeah, they made some arguments for the allowance of things like that. Some, not specifically that. But anyway, arguments need to be made. But at the very least, you have to understand that for someone like Archcast, or I would dare even say Diversity in Comics, who seems quite intent on tearing down anybody who is still anti-woke. And I think that's because, he's basically a tramp, in the sense that he has no connection to a community, a faith organization. I would dare say from what he says, probably even his family. Although, not to put too much on the man, I know that ex-soldiers have it tough. But anyway, if I'm looking at someone like Archcast, if I'm looking at someone like Diversity in Comics, people like that on the one hand, and I'm looking on the other hand, which it's bizarre to say, but on the other hand, at people like Melanie Mack and Razor Fist, and I'm asking myself, which side would the Founding Fathers actually take in this argument? Guess which one it would be? It would be Razor Fist and Melanie Mack, if you didn't get that already. Why? Because, as far as I can tell anyways, they're supporting ideas that support the American dream. And you can call them moral nags and moral busybodies all you want, but just ask yourself the question, if you do that, would you also call the Founding Fathers moral nags and moral busybodies? Because if you do, then why in the world would you defend the American experiment? Why in the world would you support ideas like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And as an extension of that, why in the world would you support ideas like an actual traditional hero, which is based upon the virtues, which is interpreted through right reason, which is necessarily part of reason and logic and interpretation of reality through reality itself using reason and logic, which is a basis of the idea that, yeah, guess what? There are things that are right and wrong. There are moral standards. There are moral absolutes. There's not just, was anyone hurt? There's not just situational ethics. And while liberalism might be a useful tool, a wrench, as it were, to help fix up the moral system when it has gone awry, when it stops working properly, that's the extent of its usefulness. And it is most definitely not the fuel by which the engine of liberty operates. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. I'm sure I'll get some very interesting comments on this video. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, and 1 low fantasy graphic novel, all centered around the idea of a traditional hero. They are merit-based in their construction, and you're looking at some of the beautiful art for those graphic novels in the background. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.